Warning: the video is made purely for educational and historical purposes only and does not advocate or incite violence or self-harm. The stories are mostly based on historical records. However, some viewers might find it disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. The human pig. Among the Vikings, this form of punishment was called Heimner. Among Asian peoples, it was known as the human pig. Surprisingly, the most horrifying execution in the world did not focus on killing the victim outright. Not only was it brutal on its own, but the unfortunate person would go on suffering for months, or even years, afterward. In Japan, for example, this punishment was inflicted on spies, prisoners of war, and traitors. The condemned would have their eyes gouged out, nose, tongue, and limbs cut off, legs at the knee, arms at the elbow, their eardrums pierced, and sometimes they were also castrated. The torture took place step by step. They would start by removing the first segments of the fingers, then the second, and so forth, stopping the bleeding each time so the victim wouldn't die prematurely. They fed and gave water to the human pig twice a day, then after a while threw the victim to starving piglets, which would tear the defenseless body apart with their tusks. In another version, the condemned was forced to live in a pigsty alongside actual pigs. In Harry Harrison's Viking-era novel The Hammer and the Cross, this punishment is described as follows. In the hideout stood a horse trough filled with straw, and in it lay a man. The chief immediately recognized Wulfgar's blonde hair and beard, but his face looked like it belonged to a corpse. Pale and waxy, his nose sharpened, bones jutting beneath his flesh. But Wulfgar was not dead. For a moment, the chief couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. How could Wulfgar fit in that trough? He was over 6 feet tall, and the trough was scarcely 5. Something was missing. Something was wrong with his legs. His knees reached the trough's edge, but beyond them there was only a grimy bandage covering stumps, rags caked with dirt and blood. Then came the smell of rot, the stench of burnt flesh. With mounting horror, the chief saw that Wulfgar had no arms either. The remains of his arms were crossed over his chest, wrapped in bloody bandages just above the elbows. A voice sounded from behind. They placed him before us, laid him on a log, and chopped off his arms and legs with an axe, legs first. Each time, they seared the stump with hot iron so he wouldn't bleed to death. At first, he cursed them and fought back. Then he started begging to keep at least one hand so he could feed himself. They just laughed. The tall Jarl said they would leave everything else intact, his eyes, so he could look upon beautiful women, his eggs, so he could desire them. But he'd never be able to take off his own pants. In fact, he'd never again do anything by himself. Now, in any action he takes, eating or relieving himself, he'll be dependent on others. He is now Heimner, a living corpse. Then Edric, who was telling the story, added, "Don't fret, chief. Infection, pain, blood loss, he won't last much longer." The execution of Viskovitov. Ivan Mikhailovich Viskovitov was a 16th century Moscow diplomat, ambassador, clerk of the Duma, keeper of the state seal, and head of the embassy office. After the Novgorod massacre in 1570, he tried to protect some of the boyars on the run, including his own relative, Tretiak, and ended up in disgrace himself. By the Tsar's decree, Viskovitov was stripped of his posts and thrown into prison along with 300 others. On July 25, 1570, in a square in Kitay-Gorod, in the presence of the Tsar himself, the charges against Viskovitov were read first. They stated he had communicated with Sigismund, planned to betray Novgorod to him. and had written to the Sultan urging him to take Kazan and Astrakhan. He was also accused of calling upon the Crimean Khan to ravage Russia. On the scaffold, Viskovitov began addressing the people, denouncing the accusations as brazen slander, but was quickly silenced. He managed to shout, "Accursed be all you bloodsuckers and your Tsar." Viskovitov was tied to a post and then dismembered alive in front of Ivan the Terrible. It is said that the Tsar's oprichniks were supposed to take turns cutting pieces of flesh from Ivan Mihailovich. One of them, Ivan Roitov, did it so clumsily that Viskovitov died. The Tsar then accused Roitov of doing this on purpose to end Viskovitov's suffering and ordered his execution. However, the plague claimed Roitov's life before the Tsar's wrath could. The execution of Basil. On March 26, 1199, during the siege of the castle of Caillois-Chabrol in France by English troops, King Richard the Lionheart personally led his men in an assault. He was struck in the neck by a crossbow bolt fired from the castle walls by a young warrior named Pierre Basilet. The king's wound enraged the English, who quickly captured the castle. Unfortunately, the injury led to blood poisoning. Knowing he was dying, Richard ordered the hanging of the entire surrendered garrison and demanded that the man who had shot him be brought before him. When Basilet was taken into Richard's tent, the king asked whether he had shot him by accident or on purpose. Pierre said he had done it deliberately. Richard had killed his father and brother. Impressed by the young man's courage, Richard Lionheart ordered Basilet to be released and given 100 shillings. But Basilet never received his money or his freedom. After Richard's death on April 6, 1199, the mercenary Captain Markadai commanded that Basil's skin be flayed from his body, a sentence that was duly carried out. Pierre was skinned alive and then hanged. The execution of the Black Widower. Simeon Fleischer, a wool weaver from the German town of Fulda, became notorious as a black widower, having killed 19 wives in the 16th century. His first marriage was to a virgin in Marburg, through which he acquired 160 guilders from her father's estate. The marriage lasted fewer than 20 weeks. Simeon murdered his wife after running out of money, then sold her clothing. He found this method of making a profit to his liking. Soon after, Fleischer married a 40-year-old widow. That marriage lasted less than 4 weeks before he killed her, too, taking her 40 guilders. From then on, the cycle of marriage and murder repeated itself. After Simeon was finally captured in Neustadt an der Weinstrasse, he was tortured for several days. He confessed that over 6 years he had married 31 women and killed 19 of them. On January 19, 1581, the black widower Simeon Fleischer was executed. He was impaled on a stake, and then pieces of his flesh were torn away with red-hot tongs, carefully keeping him alive. The entire ordeal lasted 3 days. The execution of the false emperor. Thomas the Slav, also known as the false Constantine, was an impostor and leader of one of the largest civil wars in the Byzantine Empire, taking place from 821 to 823. He claimed to be the Emperor Constantine VI, miraculously saved from being blinded, and said to have escaped the plots of his mother Irene. Few details of his biography remain. We know that Thomas was of Slavic origin, resettled in Asia Minor. He held the title of commander of one of the themes in that region. In December 821, he proclaimed himself emperor, and the rebel army under his leadership marched on Constantinople. The siege lasted over a year. In 823, Byzantine Emperor Michael II called upon the Bulgarian Khan Omertag for help. Bulgarian forces routed the rebels near the walls of the Byzantine capital. Thomas retreated with his remaining troops to Arcadiopolis, which soon fell to the Byzantines. His own followers handed him over to the emperor, and he was executed. In 823, Michael II ordered Thomas's arms and legs cut off and his torso impaled on a stake, which was duly carried out. The execution of the Anabaptists. Religious fanaticism is dangerous in all its forms. Initially, Catholic repression of the Anabaptists caused widespread resentment toward the official church, fueling the popularity of Melchior Hoffman's teachings in the Netherlands and Lower Germany. Declaring himself the prophet Elijah, Hoffman predicted Christ's second coming for 1533. He was arrested and imprisoned in Strasbourg, where he eventually died. But two of his followers from the Netherlands, a baker named Jan Matthees and a tailor named John of Leyden, founded a commune in the city of Munster in the northwest. They proclaimed the imminent appearance of Christ and the dawn of a 1,000-year reign of justice. Eager to hasten this new age, the Anabaptists seized the property of Munster's wealthier citizens and declared it communal. They called on the poor from surrounding areas to join them in sharing the city's wealth. Anyone who objected to having their property communalized faced execution. Both Catholic and Protestant nobles united against the Anabaptists and laid siege to the city. During one of their sorties, Matthees was killed. His head was mounted on a pike, and his genitals were nailed to the city gates. This did nothing to deter those inside. Leadership passed to John of Leyden. Although the Anabaptists preached equality, he soon declared himself king and introduced polygamy. Rumor held that he himself had 16 wives. He allegedly beheaded another woman in the town square for refusing to become his 17th. Starvation and disease weakened Munster's defenses, and on June 24, 1535, the city fell to the combined Catholic-Lutheran forces led by the Bishop of Munster. Many of Hoffman's followers were executed, and the leaders of the uprising met a terrible fate. John of Leyden was tortured with extreme cruelty, which he bore stoically. On January 22, 1536, he, along with Bernhard Krechting and Bernhard Knipperdoling, were tortured and then put to death. Each of the three was secured to a post by an iron collar with spikes. For an hour, their bodies were torn with red-hot pincers. Horrified by John of Leyden's torture, Knipperdoling attempted to kill himself by pressing his throat against the spike collar. The executioner then tied him firmly to the stake so he couldn't end his own life. Their tongues were ripped out with pincers before each was killed with a red-hot dagger driven through the heart. Legend claims that all 16 of John of Leyden's wives were also hanged. After the leaders were beheaded, their bodies were displayed in iron cages on the tower of St. Lambert's Church, where the cages remain to this day. The execution of the deserter. Martin Rogak, a Czech soldier turned deserter, bandit, and murderer, holds the record for the most victims in the history of the Czech lands. From 1568 to 1571, Rogak and his gang killed 59 people. In 1571, one of his accomplices, Mikuláš Mitka, was arrested in Tisnov. Under torture, he revealed Martin's location. Rogak was soon captured and confessed his crimes while stretched on the rack. His sentence, passed on February 7, 1571, was as merciless as his deeds. 10 days later, on February 17, 1571, Martin was tied to a pillory where his finger segments were cut off. Then, on the scaffold, his limbs were amputated. Finally, Rogak was impaled on a stake, dying in agony. The execution of Balthazar. From a young age, Balthazar Gerard was known for his fanatical devotion to Catholicism and his admiration for the policies of Spain's King Philip II. Once William of Orange became the independent Protestant ruler of the Netherlands, Balthazar repeatedly declared his intent to kill this man, whom Philip II had branded the scourge of Christendom and enemy of humanity. Under the alias Franz Guyon, Gerard entered William's service to carry out his plan. He even bought irregularly shaped bullets to ensure the wound would be fatal. On July 10, 1584, Balthazar slipped into William's residence in Delft and hid in a dark corner near the staircase, waiting for him to pass by. Late in the evening, William finally did. Balthazar fired 3 shots from close range, then tried to escape, pursued by the guard. He hoped to reach the moat where a saddled horse awaited, but he stumbled over a sack of refuse and was captured. Because William was deeply beloved by the Dutch, Gerard's betrayal, gaining William's trust only to assassinate him, led to an exceptionally brutal sentence. Before being quartered, Gerard was subjected to refined, meticulously planned tortures meant not only to inflict terrible pain, but also to humiliate. First, he was whipped on the rack. Then, tied to a table, his wounds were smeared with honey while a goat was brought in, its rough tongue expected to lick off the honey. Next, tight boots were placed on his feet and heated, causing them to constrict until his bones broke. Afterward, he was dressed in clothes soaked in alcohol and set on fire. Between torture sessions, they locked him in a metal ball to deprive him of rest and sleep. These torments dragged on for 3 days. Finally, on July 14, 1584, Gerard was executed. First, his right hand was burned. Then his heart was torn out, and his body was cut into 24 pieces, ending with his head being severed. Throughout his trial and torture, Balthazar showed remarkable composure and will, never displaying fear or asking for mercy. He died in agony, but his relatives were honored. Philip II elevated them to the nobility and granted them 3 estates in Franche-Comté. To this day, a street in his hometown of Villefranche bears his name, marking where he spent his childhood. The execution of the werewolf. Peter Stump was a German serial killer and farmer accused of lycanthropy, witchcraft, and cannibalism, hence his nickname, the Werewolf of Bedburg. When captured, he claimed to have practiced black magic since age 12. Peter confessed that he had made a pact with the devil, who gave him a magical belt enabling him to transform into a ravenous wolf-like creature, powerful and mighty, with large glowing eyes, a wide mouth lined with razor-sharp teeth, and huge paws. Removing the belt would return him to human form. No such belt was ever found after his arrest. For 25 years, Stump supposedly hunted goats, lambs, and sheep, along with men, women, and children. Under torture, Peter admitted to killing and eating 14 children and 2 pregnant women, whose unborn babies he tore from their wombs to devour their hearts, which he described as delicacies. One of those 14 children was said to be his own son, whose brain he allegedly ate. He was also accused of incest with his daughter, who was sentenced to death alongside him, and incest with a distant relative who was his lover. Moreover, he confessed to having intercourse with a succubus sent by the devil. Stump's execution on October 31st, 1589, together with his daughter Sybil and his lover Catherine, is considered one of the cruelest in German history. In the town of Bedburg near Cologne, he was tied to a wheel, where burning pincers tore away his flesh in 10 different places. Next, the blunt side of an axe was used to break his limbs so he couldn't return from the grave. Finally, he was beheaded, and his body was burned. His daughter and lover were also broken on the wheel, strangled, and burned alongside his remains. As a warning to other potential werewolves, authorities erected a pole topped with a torture wheel and a wolf's figure, and placed Stump's severed head at the very top. The execution of Georgi. Georgi Datsa led a peasant uprising in Hungary in the first half of the 16th century. Initially, the peasants under his leadership rose to fight Ottoman rule in the Balkans, but soon turned their weapons against their own feudal lords. Datsa was defeated in battle and taken prisoner. To terrorize the remaining rebels, the authorities subjected him to a ghastly execution. Georgi had proclaimed he would be king of Hungary, and for that, on July 20th, 1514, he was seated on an iron throne heated until it glowed white-hot, crowned with a burning iron crown, and handed a fiery scepter. After tormenting Datsa, they brought in 9 of his companions, including his younger brother and fellow rebel leader, Georgi. They first offered Georgi a piece of his brother's roasted flesh. Horrified, he refused to eat it and was promptly cut into 3 pieces. They then invited the remaining 8 to taste their leader's flesh. 5 refused and were immediately hacked to death. 3, desperate to save their own lives, ate the meat sliced from Datsa's body. They were released. That's all for now. Do not forget to subscribe and hit the bell button for more stories. Thank you for watching, and until next time.